Hey, so very excited to be sat here with Wesley Salazar, who quite boldly has taken the decision to join us on our first ever podcast, which I'm really excited to starting with you. So tech talk, scale up stories. Wesley's a really interesting guy, someone I've gotten to know quite well over the last few months. Kind of talking through, I guess your journey, Wes, from leaving high school right up to being a CTO at a scale up brand currently.
Yeah, thanks for having me, by the way. All right, yeah, so my name is Wesley. I've been in the tech field for about 18 years now. I got a degree, digital media at UCF, and that's really just anything digital. One of the areas I liked when I started was programming, right? So it was I got into, I think, Flash action script programming, and there was just something about that really caught my attention. It was like this sense of mastery that I was kind of like I had control over my environment and I could do really cool things. And I also got into web development. So it was just kind of this blend going back and forth between video game programming and web development. And while I was getting my degree at UCF, I had a job as I was an intern as a web developer. So I was able to get a lot of good experience as a web developer. And I had a couple other jobs in between where there was one job I had when I actually worked for UCF. It was called Retro Labs, and it was kind of this experimental video game lab that we would just create. One of the games we made, it was actually for the Navy. It was a game that trained on all the insignias. And so it was actually pretty cool to be able to do all of that, to learn how to program and also to learn kind of how to interact with people. So that's it. And then we'll talk through kind of the journey. So that's kind of how it started with the first few jobs. It's just kind of web development and video game programming. So
Nice. And just out of curiosity, I guess you kind of like fresh out of high school, there may have been some overlap there that you touched on. But what was it? What was it about like web development that you were like curious about? Why start in that?
well, I mean, honestly, the degree, it was digital media, but it was all things digital. So it dealt with created movies, website development, video games. So it had a kind of a little bit of everything. I don't know. There was just something about web development. I honestly, it was just there was there was more jobs kind of available when I did my internship, there were more jobs available for web development. But my passion was truly in like video games. And so back in the day, there was a program called Flash, Adobe Flash, and it was an animation platform. But they had a scripting language that was underneath it, and so you had a lot more control over what you could do. And so that was really, I don't know, there's something I really liked about that. Like I said, it was just the sense of mastery that I could have. I can animate particles, I can tell a story digitally by coding. And so that to me is really what I like to do. Web development, I just kind of got into it because again, that's all the jobs were there, to be honest. And it's one of those things where I did find a passion in web development, and eventually that's kind of where I moved from video games to web development, uh,
Yeah.
and then onto many other different things like that. So it was kind of this gateway into the digital world. So
Nice. And then I guess moving kind of on from that initial broad experience with a few different aspects in there, obviously web development being one. Talk to me about, I guess, landing your kind of first real job. Where was that? And talk to me a little bit more about that for you, because I think that's quite a common theme. Appreciate this was some time ago, but a common theme for people looking to take the step up into landing, that first role. Talk me through that. What was your experience of that?
So when I went to school, I realized really quick I wasn't going to learn anything in school itself. Like just when you look at the syllabus and you look at all the courses, everything was just very entry level, basic. And so I had to learn everything on my own. I remember went to Amazon, I bought books really high, I just stacked them really high on my chair, and I just learned all of the different things. And while I was there, they had a job placement program at UCF. And so I remember it was just like a few months in, I went to them and I'm like, hey, look, when I get my degree, I want to come out with 4 years experience. I don't want to come out with no experience. And they said, yeah, that's a great idea. And so what they did is they found an internship. It was a company called Mojo Interactive. And it was just, it was kind of a digital consultant agency that built websites for doctors and lawyers. And they were kind enough to give me an internship. It was a paid internship too, which was really good. And I was able to shadow. There was a kind of a senior web developer there, and I learned a lot from working with him. And I think I only worked there for 6 months or so, the second job I got was at Retro Labs at UCF because it dealt more with video game programming, right? And so everything was kind of Flash action script. And that's where my passion was. And so I went and I did that, and that was good. And then I moved over to another company called Digitech, right? So a lot of these were just trying to find my voice. So I would work 6 months, try to figure out what it is I like. And I felt like I was always constantly evolving and moving on. And that's kind of why I went from job to job as I continue along this journey. So
Yeah, I love that. And then there's some really good examples in there, and I think that'll speak to a lot of people. It's especially when you're younger. I think it's hard to just pick one atmosphere and that be the right fit for you. So it sounds like you learn quite a lot about yourself in kind of changing and adapting different environments. And then didn't you move to kind of South Florida? I guess I'm not sure when exactly this happened.
sure.
But
So
why was that?
yeah.
And what was going on in your life at that time?
Between all those jobs, there was one job I got. I haven't spoken about it just yet because I actually learned a lot. So I got a phone call from somebody, and they said, "Hey, we have this job. It's remote. It pays really well, and you get to do what you love. Are you interested?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he said, "Okay, well, there's a guy that's going to call you tomorrow. He's going to interview you and ask you all these questions. Here's what you say to him." And I was like, okay, all right, let's go. Because all of the jobs I had before were all going into the office. And I feel like there's just a lot of burden that comes going in the office because you have to get dressed, you have to drive, fight through all the traffic. So I got a job working for this company, ICF. It was remote. It gave me a lot of great opportunities. And something very interesting happened when I was working there is that I met a guy, and his name is Chris. And he was a very interesting guy because of the way he solved problems, the way he communicated. He had great soft skills, and he was always interested in me. He was always like, "Hey, Wesley, how you doing? What do you like to do?" And I find that very interesting that somebody would actually take the time to get to know me. And it really kind of changed my concept of like management because he was in a management position, and I really took a liking to him. And I've never had really any mentors in my life, and so this was the first time where I realized like, oh, I have this amazing mentor. And it was just the way I could describe him as kind of Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings. How there was just every time there was a scenario where you're like, all right, what's going to happen? He pulls out some type of magic trick. And I feel like he was that guy. He was a guy that always had an answer to something. And I would always get frustrated too, because I would be like, how do you know that? There's just no way you could know that. Because he always had an answer to something. And he was very intuitive with his response, very graceful. And I shadowed him for probably about 2 years, and I learned so much. I was probably humbled daily by working with him. And I always said, as like, because I think he was 37 at the time. And I was like, you know what, when I'm 37, I hope that I can be even halfway of where he's at from kind of like a technical perspective, a soft skills perspective, or even a kind of a spiritual perspective. And I really looked up to him. And one day he said, Wesley, I'm no longer happy here. I'm leaving. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, you're leaving. And that was kind of like a shock to my system because I'd gotten so used to working with him. And in many ways, I counted on him to kind of like help out a lot with things. And the concept of him leaving was a shock to my system because I realized, well, if he's gone, somebody else has to step into that role. And that's kind of where it clicked. And that's kind of like where I shifted purely just kind of an IC, right? Individual contributor. But I realized that my world was about to get a lot bigger because by him being gone, I would kind of have to step up into that role and I would kind of have to shift my responsibilities. And I remember when he left, there was just something that clicked inside of me where I became like a whole different type of developer. I learned to use my gut instinct a lot more, this like intuition. There's just this whole other side of me that kicked in where I was able to be a lot more efficient at things. And in many ways, I was kind of transforming into that concept of what he was. And so around that time, I was getting a divorce. And that is kind of where I was like, all right, well, there's nothing here for me anymore. I'm not learning. Chris is not here. I wasn't getting what I needed from a growth perspective. And I realized it was time for me to move. And that's where I moved to South Florida. And that's really where kind of everything changed. And this whole other world opens up because I'm in a whole new city and just a whole different culture, a whole different environments.
Why do you think when he left the company that your entire like outlook changed? Do you think like almost okay in the absence of Chris, someone needs to I need to kind of step up, like, because that's quite interesting that.
So here's the deal is when he was the leader of the organization. So when you go into a meeting, there's a group meeting. I hate to admit it, but sometimes you're like, all right, Chris is going to get it covered, right? He's the manager. He's going to ask all the questions, and then I will sit here and I'll listen, right? And so there's that concept that is, as long as someone is present that's in that leadership position, they're going to cover a lot of that, right? And my role is to support him. And just something about was, okay, he's gone. Somebody has to do that, right? And there was just nobody else that was in that organization that was going to cover that. And so it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to be in this position now. And at the time, I was like, I have no idea how I'm going to do that because I wasn't prepared. I took notes to a certain extent, but I wasn't prepared for that. So it's just like, all right, roles are changing, and this is what it's going to be, and this is the next evolution of your career for growth and development. So I was excited, but also a little scary as well, because where I was at. So
yeah. And I think it's interesting you say that just before we move on, because I really want to touch on the move to Florida. But I think people realize in situations like that, you are far more capable than the things you think. And when you adopt that role and it's like, well, Chris is no longer here, so someone needs to, it's interesting how as a human, you just absorb that, and you adjust and you adapt to that environment, which is just really interesting. So, okay, cool. So then we move to South Florida. What next?
yeah, this is where it gets really crazy because there was a huge transition in my life. So I was married for 6 years. It didn't work out, got a divorce. So there's that transition. My dad had just died at the time, and I was also leaving my job. And so I moved to a town that was completely foreign to me. And I remember stepping into the office, and it was just a whole new world. It was different people. The life that I had at ICF was very insular. It was isolated. It was remote, and I was only learning so much. I thought I knew a lot, and I learned a lot, and I felt like I could cover really anything I want because of what I learned at ICF. When I got to the peak activity, it was just like, no, absolutely positively nothing. Everything that you think you don't know. There's this whole other world. There's the world of DevOps and cloud infrastructure and microservices, and there's all these different languages I've never heard of. And I remember I was like, wow, this is just, there's a lot there. And I got excited because I love to learn. I love to just kind of go heads down when there's like new things that I can learn. I will just isolate myself and dedicate all resources, give up a social life, whatever I have to do to learn those new concepts. And so with peak activity, there was a lot of self-isolation where I'm like, okay, I could go have a social life. I could go and start to date again or do all of these things. And I was like, no, I'm going to learn about DevOps and Kubernetes. And at the time, I was staying at Airbnbs. I was going from one Airbnb to the next. I would have to go home every other weekend to see my daughter. So I would just go to the Airbnbs. And I remember just being kind of heads down at the Airbnbs, learning about all these cool concepts and new technologies. So it was just this exciting new world.
Did anyone help you with that, or was that purely kind of going off your own kind of back? Because I take it the need to, or the desire, which you sound quite passionate about, to get up to speed with DevOps and Kubernetes would probably have been prompted. I take it peak activity were using, those at the company. So were you kind of still having to go away off your own back? Was there any support that you had kind of to learn those on the roll?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about support. I mean, they supported me in general, like learning, but it was just something I had to take upon myself where I'm like, okay. A lot of the times is they wanted to use technologies. And they're like, well, we have this concept of Kubernetes. I don't believe they were using Kubernetes at the time, but they talked about it.
Yeah.
And when I learned about it, I'm like, oh, that's so fascinating. Like, I want to know more. And so we started to I learned about it and I started to use it on some of the projects. And that's where things get really interesting when you start introducing all of these technologies.
So that was quite a pivotal time, it sounds, in terms of what you thought you knew, and then it's like, okay, cool, I can take this like to a whole new level. So that kind of changed your aspect on that. So we're still at peak activity at the moment. And did we join there was it as an individual contributor? So you joined as a developer? And then what sort of happened next? I mean, what was going through your mind when you're okay, cool, I'm in the office. What's your then at that time, like, what's your ambition? Do you want to be a leader, architect?
Honestly, I didn't even know these titles. like architect. Like I was just such an insular word. All I wanted to do was just, the divorce was rough. And so I'm trying to drown all of my sorrows out with this new surrogate family and these new technologies. And I didn't really have any ambitions or goals, but I remember, so I did start as an IC, but I would walk into their meeting room every once in a while, and they had all of these diagrams on the walls of like all of these microservices and all this like big brain concept stuff. And they were all walking around writing stuff down. And I'm like, what's the thing? And they would explain it. I'm like, that makes no sense. And it was just, they had this idea. They wanted this back office. They wanted an admin tool that creates content and manages products and all these things. But this went on for months of like these diagrams and building it, like it was just all talk and fluff, and it was just all of these things. And so one day I just said, I can build it. I don't know what it is, but I will figure it out and I will go build it. And I remember the CEO says, okay, all right. And I remember I was like, I don't know what a PIM is. It's a product information management system, because I've heard that commerce before. Well, what is a PIM, Manish? And so he got a little napkin, he wrote it down, and I'm like, that makes no sense whatsoever. He's like, you'll figure it out, Wesley. You'll figure it out. And so I went to the Airbnb and I started to, crack the fingers, and I'm like, all right, they want a content system. I don't know much about that, but I can research it. And so I ended up found this tool. It's called Strappy. It's a Node.js headless CMS. It's a beautiful concept. It's like basically it allows you to build out REST APIs with GraphQL just like easily. And so there's like, I don't have to write much code for the backend. A lot of it's already built. And so I took that concept of what Strappy had, and I'm like, all right, let's build a CMS. I built a React front end that taps into Strappy. And within like 1 week, we had somewhat of a usable content management system with drag and drop. And so I remember I brought it to the office. And I'm like, here, guys, this is your CMS that everybody's talking about. And they're like, oh, well, what about products? And I said, okay, figure that out. So like the next week I had a PIM. I found, I think it was called Acumen. It was like a PIM that was built in PHP, but it was open source. And so I like found a demo, and I'm like, oh, that's what a PIM is. So what I did is I reverse engineered kind of everything they did, but I built it in Node.js. And so within roughly about a month, we had a content management system, a product information management system, and also a little bit of the DAM, right? So we were able to upload assets, and it became this workable product. And then they're like, oh, wow. So we actually have something that's working now. And what's the beauty of that? There was no Scrum, there was no sprint, there was nothing. That's the beauty. And that's kind of really how I work, is I don't like all of that structure and order. And what I liked about this is that nobody really told me anything. I just went and did it, demoed it. Everybody's like, hey, this looks good. Let's make these changes. And I had a lot of creative freedom. And then the next step was like, okay, well, let's get clients on it. And so we had a customer that we were working, we were able to get them on the platform. And then it's like, okay, let's get other customers and other customers. And eventually we had 7 or 8 different customers that were on the platform that were using this. Yeah, it just became this whole thing. And I don't know, it was a kind of a beautiful process of coming in, knowing very little, and then translating all of that into something that's kind of this workable product. So it was a beautiful experience for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's a hell of a journey. I didn't know that in as much detail, and I think that is a prime example of jumping in at the deep end with no armbands on, and it's like sink or swim, right? Yeah, it's a really really cool story. And then what was next for you then? I guess look, you've clearly earned some kudos, one would assume, in the peak activity office as a result of that piece of work. So what kind of happens next for you?
That's a good question. So at that point, I'm like, all right, Manish, let's talk, job titles, like, because we were trying to figure out everything. And eventually it became, CTO. And I never really thought about what that meant, but the job title, Chief Technology Officer, was given to me on that front. And then it's like, okay, great, now what? And then this is where things kind of shifted, because it became more of a leadership role. It was no longer just, hey, I'm an individual contributor. It's, hey, I have to help lead a team of people, because the product was getting bigger, and it wasn't just a one-man show. It had to be multiple people on the product. And so this is kind of like where it's like, okay, well, I've only known a small amount of something. Now it's like, hey, there's a world. You thought your world was small and it got bigger. Now your world's going to get even bigger, because now you're being introduced to the element of people management. And you tell me a concept, I will program it. But soft skills, I don't even know what soft skills were at the time. I was like, what does this mean, soft skills? And this is the concept of being able to work with people, being able to communicate effectively with people. But I think for me, the biggest challenge was learning to be patient with people, right? Because I have a certain way of doing things, and it's fast, it's A to B real quick, right? Everybody else has a very different experience. And so my challenge was learning to be patient with people and kind of accept that they're at this spot in their career. And it is now my job to help get them to a higher spot. And along that way, it's learning to be patient, learning to communicate. And it's also kind of learning when maybe enough is enough, right? Learn to have that balance between saying, hey, you're not going to work out here versus, hey, I see promise in you, let's try to make it work. And so that was kind of a really big challenge for me, is being able to have soft skills and being able to work with people and be patient with them.
And that was just for context. I mean, how big was the team that you kind of inherited?
Yeah, it was rather small. I think it was like 5 or 6 different guys that I had working for me. So it was kind of small in that sense. And then it wasn't necessarily just, there was probably about 14 developers, but I had 6 direct reports. But I also had to work with the other developers that were not direct reports because they were contributing client side code. So I was managing all of the content management system, but we had clients that actually connect to the content management system. So you had a bunch of developers that were working on those teams that were managed by different people, but I had to kind of effectively work with them to help with their implementation of our systems. So it was probably about 14 developers in total.
Okay, that's
that
yeah.
I
I mean,
had to
that's
work
a
with.
hell of a difference, isn't it? And I just for context, just before we kind of move on that, what does managing people kind of mean, I guess, from your experience? Because I haven't done it personally myself, and a lot of others haven't. And you kind of have this idea in your head, well, managing people is understanding what's going on at home, the sort of the more emotional aspect, not just, okay, how well are you performing at your job, but there are obviously other things that go into that. We're all human beings. I mean, what does that look like, or what did that look like for you? And what maybe surprised you in that?
I think for me at the time, managing people was kind of like, it was almost a selfish concept. It's like getting them to do their job, right? How can they do their job so that this product can succeed? And it was never, what are they going through? What are their motivations? What are their passions? And how can you motivate them to do their job, right? It was always just, no, you have to do it. It has to be right. It was never, hey,
Yeah.
let's sit down, go have a cup of coffee. Let's understand what's going on in your life and what is it that you want to accomplish. And is this role even a good fit for you? And what type of leadership styles do you resonate with? Because some people like the straight to the point, other people like more of the soft approach. And so, but I've learned over time that it's not that simple with people, and it's just kind of learning kind of where they're coming from and what are the best ways to get them excited and engaged. And the way I always look at it is when I look at Chris, like what did he do, right? Like I was going nowhere in my career. I was kind of just an average developer. Like honestly, it was all of a sudden I get inspired by someone. I see someone, they inspire me, and I want to be like them. And I'm like, man, it just flipped the switch and turned me into a whole different type of person that I didn't even know I was capable of. And so I see the same thing in all the other people I work with. Is that everybody has that capability, and it's just more about trying to lead by example and also see how I can inspire them to be their best self in terms of a developer or as a person in general.
I love that. And one thing I'm mindful of, this is a lot, right? I mean, all of a sudden, this has transitioned from you moving to a new city, the home stuff going on in the back of your head, which sounds like you've channeled then into, tunnel vision, focused on my work, as many do. But where is Wes at now in your mind? Just how you're feeling about things, because you're now inheriting other people's problems, other people's sort of baggage. You haven't been a leader before. So where are you at? I mean, was that difficult for you? Were there challenges?
I was pretty much in a terrible spot, to be honest. Like it was just one of those things that I didn't take any time for myself. I didn't have the social life that maybe I needed. I was not a good father. I was an absent father. I would go home and I would just be like, I would just not be present with her as much as I could. And I was so focused on work and this product, like I felt like my marriage had failed. I blamed myself, internalized myself for the marriage. And so I looked at peak activity, this product I built. I didn't want this product to be a failure. And so I put all of my energy on making sure that this was going to be my successful marriage with my surrogate family. And so I put everything I had into that, but I didn't take care of myself and I didn't give myself any of the things maybe I needed spiritually. And so as a result, it did translate with the way I interacted with people. I was just upset and I was just overall not happy with kind of where I was. Like it was a pretty dark time for me, honestly. So I can go into the office, I could be happy, I can smile, I can do all of these things, and I go home and I'm just like, man, this is not fulfilling. I don't think this is what I want. And I remember at the time I had a friend, her name is Katie. She was just one of those people that was just free love and spirit that got involved in all of these shady organizations and cool, like she's a really cool person. But she told me, she's like, I'm part of this group and he's a shaman and he does this thing called ayahuasca. It's like this tea they drink. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, well, what happens when you drink it? She's like, well, you get visions, you see things, you throw up. It's just this whole experience. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't sound appealing at all. And she's like, no, you have to try it. And, she tried to get me to do it for a while. And it didn't resonate with me. I'm like, it just sounds terrifying the way that you explain it. And, I don't want to get involved in all of that. And then I just got to a point where I was just really unhappy with where I was at in peak activity and kind of the way that I was coming across the organization. And I just went for it. And I remember I show up and there's a shaman there and they have a drink. They gave me the drink. And I remember it took like 30 minutes to kick in. But once it kicked in, it was just like reality did not exist. And it was just like terrifying. The stuff that I went through, I would say that it was the single most terrifying night of my life, but also the most exciting because there was so many people present. There was musicians there and there was just so many different things. And while I was on that journey, I was going through these roller coaster of emotions, just crying, happy, grateful, crying. And like one of the visions I got is like, you have to go home. You have to move. You cannot be here anymore in South Florida. You have to go home and you have to be a father. And if you do not do that and you stay here, you will not find the things you need. And it said, go home. And so I remember like the next day, I called the lady, was staying at like a nice beachfront place. And I'm like, hey, I got to cancel. She's like, well, that's going to be $3,000. Very disappointed. And I'm like, I'm going home to see my daughter. She was like, okay. And so I remember I packed up my toothbrush and my laptop because that's literally all I had. And I started to drive home. But then she called me and she says, don't worry about the $3,000. I'll cancel that. You're going home. You're doing the right thing. And so I moved to be with my daughter and I started to kind of rekindle and just work on a better relationship with her. And I felt a lot happier when I did that. And a lot of that translated to kind of like how I started to manage people. And I went back to a couple more ceremonies and each ceremony was a different topic. And one of the topics that I went through in my is how to have really good soft skills. And I remember, at peak activity, there was this guy there that just drove me nuts. I didn't like him. He was just the opposite of me, which is why I didn't like him. He had wonderful soft skills, did not have great hard skills whatsoever, but he had amazing soft skills. And I got a vision of him in one of the ceremonies. It said that you hate this guy because he's everything that you can be. And you have to cultivate what this guy has. And you have to integrate. And instead of not liking the guy, you should love him, embrace him because he's everything that you want to be. And you are everything that he wants to be. Because I had the hard skills, he had the soft skills. And I started to get a lot of these visions about kind of people I was interacting with that really did change the game of how I manage, but also kind of how I viewed people. And I always wanted to be the smartest person in the room. There was this drive to be this egotistical, smartest person in the room. And after sitting with the medicine, we call it the medicine ayahuasca, it's called medicine, but after sitting with it, I started to learn that I should want to be the least smartest person in the room. And that as long as I'm in a room where everybody else is smarter than me, I always have something to learn. And that's you go back to Chris, he was definitely the smartest person in the room. And once he left, I was not fulfilled or happy because I just felt like I couldn't learn as much.
Yeah.
And I just felt like I didn't have enough to teach people at the time. And so that kind of changed the landscape of how I manage people and also the landscape, pay attention to the people that are around me. and I can learn a thing or two from them. So that's kind of like the journey in South Florida, and that's so.
Mm. That's yeah, that's very, very powerful. And I think it's really interesting to hear how that's changed your outlook, but not only temporarily. It sounds like it's completely changed your permanent outlook on how you interact with others, how you view the world, what you deem and value as important for yourself in a professional and personal environment as well, which is incredible. And then just kind of mindful of time, Wes, on this as well. But where are we kind of at today then? I guess now you are, a fully fledged, chief technology officer at Thinkbean, and it sounds like it's quite a nice kind of way to sort of wrap up, because you sound like you had all, you've been on that journey where you were an excellent, well, actually quite nervous software engineer. You mentioned there, quite an average software engineer by your own admission. Change that really off your own back through fear, through, your own personal circumstances, channeling that energy. You've then gone, okay, I'm not great at the soft skills. You've built those. And then, I mean, now you're obviously the CTO at Thinkbean. How has your experience kind of shaped, the person you are today, and where is Wes at today?
I am always learning. I am humbled daily, always learning something new. I'm always amazed that when I think I know something, I'm like, man, I do not know that. And especially from like people management, because everybody's different. I definitely say that I try to find people that are smarter than me. And if you're just go, here you go, do your thing. Because I always want to be able to learn from people, even if they report to me. It's like I want you to be smarter. I need you to be smarter. I need you to come to the table with great ideas. It's my job to give you the canvas to have all of these great ideas, bring them to the table. I want to be humbled. Please humble me. I'm here to learn, and when I'm humbled, I learn something new. And so that's kind of like where I'm at. Is I'm trying to surround myself with those type of people. I try to empower them as much as I can. If they have ideas, instead of saying, no, we're not going to do that, I try to say, oh, okay, that's interesting. Let's roll with it. And I try to give them that area to grow and learn.
Yeah, thanks ever so much for that, Wesley. So one thing I'm quite keen to touch on is, it sounds like peak activity was quite transformative, both at your time in the role, but also, I guess, what was going on for you, as you've just touched on there, in your personal life, and finding spirituality and coping mechanisms, and how that changed your outlook. So I'm curious, and I'm always curious to know as well, like, what was the driver for you then to perhaps look to move on from peak activity?
Yeah, good question. I think it was a combination of many different things. One of them is I moved, right? So I was in South Florida, but now I'm back home where my daughter is. And I bought a house at the time, and just didn't feel like peak activity was my home anymore. And I think in many ways I got kind of burnt out from building this Rev Commerce. Like I put almost 4 years of energy and everything I had into it. And there were some challenges at scale with it, and there were just many different things, right, in regards to like how it was being managed, or like the people that are on the team versus and myself. There's just many different factors, and I think a lot of it came down to as I was just burned out, and I needed a break. I needed to just work on something else. I just needed a fresh start. And that's kind of where I spoke to the CEO, and I'm like, hey, I'm sorry, but I just don't think it's going to work out. I have to take a break. I have to walk away from this and kind of recharge and start anew. And so that's kind of what happened, and it kind of fell off. Gave it 2 weeks notice, and I moved over to another company, which is Payrix.
What did you then join? What was your position in Payrix? Was it a lateral
Yeah,
move, or was that a bump up?
yeah. So that it's interesting because it's the first job that I've ever had in the 18 years is where I don't code. So it was not a coding position. It was purely engineer and manager. And I was like, all right, this is going to be interesting, because that's something they needed at the time. And they looked at my resume and they said, we're looking for more of a manager, because they already had all the engineering talent. They had probably some of the top engineering talent I've ever seen. I was like, holy shit, these guys are good. What am I going to do here? And so they're like, okay, you're engineering manager. I'm like, all right, great. And there was just no role. Nothing was really defined. It was just come in and be an engineering manager. And so one of the first things I did there is I was like, I always look for documentation. It's really important. I got to have good documentation. And as I was going through it, there was just documentation that was lacking. So I spoke. I was like, hey, there's no documentation. They're like, yeah, I know. That's one of the areas that we need to improve upon. I mean, there was documentation. Don't get me wrong, but it was just I wanted detailed docs. When I do documentation, I like to just break it all down and get crazy with it. So part of what I said is, all right, I'm going to understand this product because it was hard for me to wrap my head around the product because it was the way that it was architected. It was all like microservice based. And there was like 14 microservices in total, and it was just very difficult to kind of put them all together and visually understand what it was. And so I went through, I documented everything, and then I started to see some of the pain points that were lacking in the organization, like just maybe from a DevOps perspective, right? And so like what I started to do is as I found the gaps, I started to make improvements in those gaps. And that became my job, is trying to fix the assembly line. But also I think I had 14 direct reports, which was a lot. And so I had to meet with each one of those guys, probably once a week to kind of understand. So there was just a lot of working with people, trying to manage them, but also I took it upon myself to kind of improve the process because there was a lot of pain points. And part of working with these people and hearing what their complaints were, it's like, okay, I can help. And so I heard the complaints, I took notes, found the gaps, and I just went for the jugular, right? Of like, let's just fix this, let's get it all done. So it was very interesting, and I never really touched a line of code during my time there, which was very interesting and a little bit unsettling, to be honest. I was not in my comfort zone. It was like I just want to code. I want to fix that. I see it. I want to fix it. I want to get that done. And they're like, no, 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 different role here. And so it was very interesting during my time there.
And were you still fulfilled? Because it sounds like, I mean, even on this call alone, you talk probably most passionately when you talk about these things that you're building and having a problem and actually not knowing what the answer is and going away and finding a solution. So how were you feeling in yourself being a
Out
manager?
of out of place completely, because all the problems have really ever been solved. Like the product has already been built. I wasn't coding, and a lot of it was like question of like in my because I've always looked at engineering managers. I'm like, oh God. And so I've never really took the role as serious, and so there's a part of me that was just like, I wonder if I'm really having an effect here. I saw that I was having an effect, but there's just a part of me that was like, I wonder if these guys, because a lot of the guys were just poker players, and I could never get a read of some of them. And there was also kind of a language barrier of like the difference or the impact I was making. But I was learning a ton because I learned job interviews. Like I interviewed probably about 50 people because I was building a team. And that was a lot of fun, is being able to talk to people and understand, what makes people tick. And I learned a lot about people management just by interviewing people and trying to go through that. And that was a lot of fun. I did have a lot of fun doing job interviews with them, especially when I didn't really know much about the product, but I had to explain the product. And so I learned a lot from the product by just going through and, having to really truly understand it. So it was a very interesting time for me. That's for sure.
And when you're sat opposite someone, because I guess it's interesting, because I mean, I work in recruitment, right? So I speak to a lot of people every day. When you're sat opposite someone in that position, you mentioned they were growing a team, 50 interviews. What is it you look for in them? Because I speak to a lot of people and they're like, especially good ICs, they're like, I can't explain exactly how I do the things I do. You wish you could give the blueprint to someone. So it's hard to replicate you in an individual, right? I mean, I'm curious to get your, as a technical leader, what is it you look for when you're sat opposite someone?
That is such a hard question to answer because it all depends on the role, depends on like where I'm at, it depends on the person. I think good communication skills. They have to be able, I mean, that's just kind of a no-brainer. They have to be able to effectively communicate. I believe in problem solving skills a lot. I'm just gonna be honest, I very seldom look at resumes, like because it's all just usually a bunch of bullshit. It's fluffed, it's built out, and it's dragged out. And so what I'll do is I'll skim a resume very brief. But like I also know that a lot of that stuff in there is just not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is the ability for someone to kind of problem solve. And so a lot of the times I will give these scenarios where we need to build something from scratch, right? And I'll go through like this whole systems design interview where I'll tell them, have them explain to me how they would build it and why, and I'll just go through this like approach where I play devil's advocate and I'll like go back and forth, and it's just during that time I can kind of see and get a good impression from them of like how they are. And another technique that I like to do is I like to have a project that's completely broken or it's not optimized, and I'll put it in front of them and I'll have them kind of troubleshoot it for me, because I believe that the ability to have good instincts, that is not something that you can learn from a course, and it's something you either have or you don't have, and you can learn it over time, but that becomes with experience. And in the beginning, my instincts were not great, but they got a lot better. And so I look for someone that has really good instincts, and is able to make connections without seeing tangible evidence. So between that and good communication skills and experience, I mean, there's a lot of intangibles that I look for. And when I feel it, if I get the whole thing is if I get goosebumps, it's a good thing, right? And so a lot of times you have such great chemistry with someone you're interviewing and you're having a good time, and you're like, holy shit, I like this guy. There's a no-brainer. He's going to come work for this organization. There's other guys where I'm just like, I'm not as moved by them. I'm like, they could be a good fit, but there's like this chemistry that's not there. When I worked with Payrix, most of all the guys I interviewed, I was just always blown away. I was like, holy shit, this guy's amazing. Where did they find this guy? Keep bringing him in. And so it was just a no-brainer. I brought him, I hired him, I brought him in the team. There was only one guy that didn't work out. But all the other guys, I was very proud of the team I had built there. And I remember when I left, it was interesting because I had a lot of developers that had called me, and they were like sad. They were like, I am so sad to see you go. You actually had such a huge impact. And like I got teary-eyed because I didn't even realize, because I was wondering, like, am I having an impact? I know I'm having an impact. Like, how great of an impact am I really doing? Because it was hard for me to see results. That was the issue. And the result, like the feedback I got from everybody was like, holy shit, you were the first engineering manager that actually came in, got his hands dirty, was not afraid to jump in and take initiative. And nobody ever had to tell you really what to do. You just went and did it. And so that was kind of this positive affirmation that I really appreciated. And I'm like, okay, so whatever I was doing there, that worked. So now I'm going to continue to improve upon that and bring that to my next position.
And talk me through that exit, right? Because it sounds like, it's hard. I guess it must be hard when you've built something like that, especially when there are human beings involved in that and there's connections and, emotional attachment. Talk me through that exit. What was it about that made you want to perhaps part ways with them?
Honestly, I could not connect to the product. It's this whole, like, so it was beautifully architected. Like, I've never seen such a wonderful work of art in the way that it was architected. But it was about 14 different microservices, and it was complex and complicated. There's a lot going on. The pipeline was complex. They had to separate it apart into like 3 or 4 different teams, right? So each team would get 3 to 4 microservices, and it was just hard for me to have any tangible hand in the product. I couldn't grasp the product in the way that I wanted to. And I felt like I could never get in and understand it the way that I wanted to. And I didn't feel connected to the product. I felt detached. And I knew that if I coded there, that I just wouldn't have room to code over there because I was doing all just the management. So there was just a part of me that wanted to have a blend of the worlds, kind of how I had a peak activity, even though sometimes I don't want that because it's too much. I wanted that, and I just didn't feel that I was able to create. I like to be able to create and manifest and bring things out, and I felt like everything was already created there, and it was just a matter of sustaining everything.
Yep.
And so I just didn't feel connected, and I made the decision to leave, and it was that. So it was the right decision, no doubt. So
yeah, awesome. And then I know we've touched on this, but it's quite a nice sort of story arc, I think, that you've gone, by your own admission that you mentioned there when you first started out as an IC, as many do, you have, I guess, an element of imposter syndrome. You mentioned, I think it's quite important to be self-aware. I mean, you mentioned on this call there that you felt you were perhaps a bit of an average, a software engineer. You went in, effectively built that CMS from scratch without having any great deal of, professional experience, so learning the more, harder skills, and then going, okay, well, perhaps I'm not, quite where I'd like to be on the soft skills, looking at other individuals and go, okay, well, that guy kind of has, excellent, is an excellent communicator, someone who has really positive interactions. You've gone away and you've done that. So how do you think this experience has kind of shaped now? Okay, cool. Like, I mean, look, no one's the finished product, right? But you're now obviously the chief technology officer at Thinkbean. How do you think this has kind of shaped you? And do you now feel like I guess every day is a learning day, but you have kind of, incorporated both of those worlds to kind of make you a more impactful, I guess, individual?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's kind of complex. As you touch, I am always learning every day. There's something new to learn. Um, and I think right now it's we're kind of in maintenance mode, right? So we have a product, we released it, and we're just maintaining it and slowly adding new features as we roll out. Um, I think as long as things are consistent and moving along the assembly line, I think I learned the most when new things are presented, right? So there's new scenarios. Okay, well, if they say, Wesley, we want to build a team of 5 more engineers, I think there's a ton of room for growth because, right now I manage 6 engineers, but we move it up to 10, 15. I think there's now I have to get, I have to split it out where I have, sub reports and kind of change the landscape of the thing, right? So I think I would learn the most when things change, but right now things are kind of the same, and so I think I'm at a very good spot. I'm at a comfortable spot, and it kind of matches up with kind of what's going on with my life outside of work right now, because I'm investing a lot of time into myself. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think that I think the next step for me would be what I would be interested in doing is managing bigger teams and scaling teams.
Yeah.
And so I think that's definitely going to be in the future where I can take it. And it might be a thing where I might have to step away from coding at some point. As much as I don't want to do that, I might. But there's also the other option of just going back and just being an IC and just coding things. So I think there's many different options. I could probably be happy doing either or. But I think there's a lot of benefit to managing people. And I think that what Chris done to me in terms of like his mentorship and how he really has shaped the course of my life, as dramatic as that sounds. I would be remiss to go back to just coding because I could have an impact on people like Chris had an impact on me.
Yeah.
Who's to say, I haven't with some of the guys. I've had a lot of guys where I've had a similar impact, and I don't know. I want to do that. I want to probably do that the rest of my life. Is I want to be able to teach and mentor other people, and bring all of the things that I've learned to them, but at the same time grow and learn from them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really great, Wes. And look, I've got a closing question, which I'd be keen to get your opinion on, but yeah, thank you ever so much for coming on this. I guess just to close off, being on the journey that you've been on, what advice would you offer to, someone looking to either start a career in software engineering or someone who's looking to perhaps progress their career in software engineering? Yeah, what advice would you offer, or to a younger Wes?
Ramp up or start their career, or
Either or,
both.
really. Yeah, I mean, or both. I think if we start with like start your career, because I'd be interested to get your opinion on that, because it's a funny job market, and that's often the hardest step, especially for software engineers.
It comes down to passion, and what I've learned in all of this is that you can't assume somebody's going to teach you anything. All the online courses, they're only going to teach you the basics. If you truly want to get into this field, you have to create and build things, right? So you want to be a web developer, well, go build a website for yourself. Go build something. You don't know how to do it. It doesn't matter if you don't know how to do it. You can learn along the way. By doing that, by building things and just jumping in instead of just learning and get caught up in all these courses. By jumping in, there's like a whole different thing that happens. And that can spark a passion. And when you have that passion, and that's kind of one of the things I didn't touch on it, but I look for that passion too. Like, you might not know anything technically, but I'm willing to overlook that. If you're passionate about what it is you do, you're going to put the time and all of that stuff. So I say that make sure it's something you're passionate about. And you only can figure it out if you start to build things. Just go out there and build things. Just start now. Don't make excuses. Just build it. That's what I did when I was in school. I didn't wait for the teachers to teach me anything. I just went and built things, and it was the best I ever made for my career.
Yeah. Just get out there, throw yourself in the deep end, and do the ugly stuff. It's going to be ugly initially, but I think getting out there and taking that initial jump is, like you say, is probably the most important step.
And never be the smartest person in the room. You want to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you, probably going to make you feel uncomfortable. And you got to just throw all the ego, because when you can surround yourself with these people, you will learn from them and also build great networking opportunities. So never strive to be the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, I love that. Wes, I just want to say thank you ever so much. This does mean a lot. I really appreciate you being the first person to throw your name in the hat. That's been a really awesome conversation. We've covered so much ground. And I think you've got a really interesting and very inspiring story, and I think it's important we talk about these things. And I'm sure, budding young Weses earlier on in their career at the moment can listen to something like this and, seek comfort in that, look, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, right? There's, you might look at what someone is doing right now, but it takes a certain amount of grit and resilience to get to that point. It's not all going to be easy along the way. And I think that your story is really testament to that. But look, thank you ever so much. Wes, it's been an absolute delight speaking to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been a good time. So